Welcome everyone, and welcome to this latest RICS Tech Partner video discussion. My name is Andrew Knight. I've been with RICS for nearly 12 years now, and I sit within the knowledge and practice area of the organisation. And my brief is to look at the whole impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 110,000 members working worldwide, right across the property life cycle through land, planning and development, construction, valuation, brokerage, property management, building management, end of life, it's clearly a huge, rich, broad canvas upon which data and technology is having a really profound and valuable impact. And indeed, our members work across a whole host of different asset types: land itself, commercial, residential, mixed use, infrastructure, alternatives. So once again, large areas where data and technology can have a huge effect. And I'm really glad today to have Nikki join me from VU.CITY. So please do join me, Nikki.
Afternoon, Andrew. Nice to see you on this snowy Monday afternoon.
Indeed. No, and apologies to viewers that I'm slightly kind of wearing my fleece here to make sure we keep the temperatures up, because it is incredibly cold at the moment in the UK. So a particular cold snap following on from an incredibly hot summer. So a year of contrasts. Now, Nikki, before we get into the bits and bytes and talking a bit more detail about what VU.CITY does, it'd be great to hear a bit about your backstory and indeed the origin story of VU.CITY itself.
Sure. I ended up working in the built environment sector out of complete surprise, to be honest with you. I did a totally unrelated degree and was one of those graduates who wasn't 100% sure what they wanted to do after university, and found myself with an opportunity to work at a global property super brand, and specialised at the time in portfolio transactions of property, and found it was such a really interesting sector, really diverse, incredibly complex. And I think it tends to be one of those sectors that everyone can find something that interests them, which I absolutely loved about it. But one of the things that I found through doing that was that the property sector, as a general rule, and I am making a big generalization here, probably isn't as technologically enabled or advanced as other sectors are, and probably hasn't kept up with the swathes of innovations that have swept through different sort of digital schemes that other industries have benefited from. And got a little bit of a bee in my bonnet about that as a general rule, and thought, you know, I really want to be part of a company that's doing something positive in that space and is having a real impact. And hence stumbled upon VU.CITY, who are doing exactly that, trying to bring elements of digitization to the planning industry as a bit of a starting point, and help people understand what efficiencies and benefits 3D visualization can bring to their respective roles, which kind of leads me on quite nicely, I suppose, to the origin story of VU.CITY, which was founded by a visual design agency and a rights of light surveyor who, amongst themselves, kind of had this thought that we really don't understand, or we really struggle to understand and visualize how the cities and places that we are designing in change cumulatively and on a really broad scales. And actually, to be able to form policy and make decisions, we need to understand what that change looks like on citywide scales. And so they started in London, ended up modelling the entirety of London, including upcoming schemes and schemes that are coming through the planning process, and then expanded now to 23, 24 towns and cities across the UK, all of various different sizes, different characters, different textures, and we're kind of going from there, really, and working with both the public sector and the private sector to try and show both sides what they can understand and what they can gain from visualization.
Thanks, Nikki. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that the sector, and it is, you say, it's a bit of a cliche and a generalization to talk about its place on that journey. But I guess it's always important to highlight that there are certain parts of the industry that are clearly very advanced. But as you say, if you look at it in the round, there's still a lot of opportunity there. And it's interesting you mention moving outside of London, because the previous discussions I've had, we've looked at examples in London specifically, and I'm really interested to hear about how you feel that kind of 3D visualization that VU.CITY does can work in other cities, where I'm thinking particularly about those cities that do have pretty unique heritages in terms of their built environment. I mean, examples like Oxford and Cambridge particularly, which obviously present, and clearly there are parts of London that have similar challenges, but you've got cities there that are so quintessentially British in their architectural heritage. How can it work in those kind of environments?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that we recognise, that the challenges that each town and city across the UK faces is inherently unique to that place, and every single place has got different things that they want to focus on and different challenges that they come across. And you're absolutely right that places like Oxford and Cambridge, the feel of those places and the heritage of those cities is really critical, both to their success but also to their evolution in the future. And in our eyes, 3D visualization plays a really important part in that, because particularly in places where there is heritage to pay regard to, being able to understand the impact of what a proposal is going to have is really critical. And I think for us, particularly in places like Oxford and Cambridge, getting the right people in the room, whether physical or virtual these days, and all on the same page and all discussing the right matters is really important. But that goes hand in hand, that discussion goes hand in hand with an understanding of those challenges. And particularly in the built environment, like I said, there are so many different disciplines and everyone has different specialisms and everyone is coming from different technical understandings, and getting to the point where you are able to articulate what your challenge is from your particular technical discipline, be that heritage or something else, really helps progress those conversations and also get people to understand where it is that you're coming from, and perhaps that's a policy point that you're trying to articulate and trying to demonstrate. So I think understanding is a big part of that, and particularly in areas of heritage where there is, I think, a misunderstanding that heritage is in conflict with change, and it isn't. You know, there are ways in which we can enhance the places of our heritage with development and with changes to our built environment that perhaps is misunderstood a little bit. But it's not. Go on. Sorry, it's not just about a site. I think it's also about the grander context of the decisions. You know, we're not just thinking about the site where the proposal of change is happening, but the cumulative impact across that town or that city, Oxford or Cambridge, whatever it may be, and understanding what that looks like. That's really important.
And I suppose you're thinking on that, you know, whether it's Oxford or Cambridge or I don't know, a city like Bath. I mean, so often you'll be looking at, as you say, that conflict that almost arises inexorably between the kind of people who are looking to protect heritage and obviously people who want to enable development. And so often you're looking at effectively infill, aren't you? You're looking at putting some kind of new development in that kind of setting. And obviously there are issues around skyline, obstruction. I mean, once again, how does visualization help people resolve that tension?
I think there's a couple of different ways, and you are right that in places where there is a particularly rich heritage, that level of integration, I think, of a scheme is particularly key. And again, for me, it's about understanding the impact of those changes as early as possible. So to give you a bit of a working example, Oxford is particularly famous for its historic skyline, the dreaming spires of Oxford, the picture postcard that we've all seen. And I think when there are proposals that are coming from various different applicants in the city centre, understanding how those proposals interplay with that skyline, if at all, or perhaps on the flip side, providing assurance that it doesn't, can only really be done by visualizing it and placing that proposal into its wider context. And then what 3D visualization does is gives you the ability to explore as if you were in that city and see what that change actually looks like in the future. And again, it's not just about the existing context, but against the proposals that are currently being built, or what else has been approved and what else is coming through the system that doesn't actually exist yet, but is going to be part of those places in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I think it's that. I think it's about being able to plug and play a little bit, I guess, and being able to test and being able to actually see what those changes look like on a citywide scale that's really important, and helps provide reassurance on both sides. You know, it helps open up that conversation as early as possible, and it helps both sort of sides of the table interrogate that information as early as possible in the process.
And are you seeing, because I mean it is a challenge, isn't there? There are so many stakeholders that are part of this process. Are you seeing an openness to heritage groups, to planners, to local authorities, to private developers, to the engagement with the broader community? Are you seeing this sort of visualization being accepted as a way of resolving these tensions?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not always about resolving tensions, I suppose. Because sometimes it's not a tension to be resolved, but still a story to be told and still a discussion to be had, whether whether contentious or not. And we are seeing more and more groups who are responsible for heritage conservation wanting to see 3D as an element of that discussion, because it really helps not only for them to understand it, but helps for them to put messages across to the public or communicate that further and sort of, I suppose, justify why certain decisions have been made. And to give you a little bit of an example, and there's a few floating around actually, but the Oxford Preservation Trust in Oxford are particularly pro the use of 3D visualization of new schemes that come across in the centre of Oxford, and for exactly that reason, because it helps them see what that change is actually going to look like. But actually, on a broader scale than that, Historic England are actually starting to feed the use of 3D through into their technical advice notes without getting too into the weeds. In their recent update of their technical advice note, they specifically said that there are benefits to 3D, and particularly in the cases where there are tall buildings, visualization can really help communicate what a proposal looks like, and also again that sort of plug and play element, play around and see whether or not there is a more appropriate positioning for that scheme, or setting back of certain areas, so on and so forth. So yeah, it absolutely is feeding through.
Now, thinking of a kind of broader sort of landscape around housing in particular, obviously recently the Secretary of State has scrapped the housing target, so there's further debate and discussion about the whole levelling up and regeneration bill. If we're going to see changes in the way that the housing development, the housing standard methodology is going to change, what do you think we need to see as a sector in reaction to that?
God, that's a big question, isn't it? I think one of the things that really needs some consideration is things like the 35% urban uplift that was imposed on some local planning authorities across the UK, that they had to provide 35% on top of what the standard method was calculating in terms of their housing need figure. And often because those local authorities were in urban areas, they're incredibly constrained either by boundary or lack of land availability, or perhaps sometimes it's a physical constraint. Like in Brighton, for example, you've got beautiful downs to the north, but also the sea to the south. So there's certain constraints in certain areas, and I think the impact of making decisions like that and imposing that sort of uplift on urban areas, I think really needs to be explored before it is perhaps legislated for. Because one thing that 3D visualization does is it allows you to test different scenarios. If you were to impose X, Y, and Z, what impact does that have? And inevitably, if you were to impose something like the 35% urban uplift, then these local authorities often only have two choices. It's either increase density or go taller, and both come with different and sometimes related challenges. But I think exploring those again as early as possible in the process and really understanding what the impact of these policy decisions is critical to getting them right.
Indeed. I mean, it's that whole ability to effectively model, isn't it, and look at different scenarios that will get that, hopefully, the best result. Now, another element of the legislation is looking at, digital planning tools. I mean, what are your thoughts on both that sort of legislative piece around enforcing or mandating or kind of approving digital planning, and also specifically the use of these tools in this kind of heritage listed building type sort of context?
That's a really good question, and I think I'll answer it in sort of two stages, because I think there's an underlying but connected challenge to any form of mandating should the government choose to explore that. And between you and I actually don't think you should mandate specific tools. I think there is the opportunity to mandate perhaps a type of technology at certain stages, but actually I think if the bones of a structure are there, then people will adopt the right tools for that specific authority and to answer those specific challenges that each authority has. But the underlying thing that fits with all of that is the standardization of data. One of the biggest challenges that we have as an industry is not just the availability of data to us, but what format that data takes, and whether that data is machine readable, and whether platforms like VU.CITY or other digital planning tools can use it and learn from it and enable our users to really use that data and interpret it in as best way as possible. And the sort of standardization of data is the first stage, and then it's down to companies like us to help make it understandable, make it usable, and make it accessible. And that's kind of why I'm saying I don't think the tools need to be mandated, because I think if the groundwork is there, then the rest will sort of take care of itself. And it's actually that standardization of data piece that unlocks all the other possibilities of what digital tools like VU.CITY and others can help local planning authorities achieve.
Yeah, I think it's such a key point that, and as you say, it's not really about mandating specific solutions, but it's those foundations. I mean, we're talking about the built environment, so you end up using sort of cliched relevant words, but without that kind of commonality of language around data. And I think also thinking about the ethical and the governance issues as well, to make sure that data does flow around in that controlled way, particularly when you're looking at something like planning, where there can be sensitivity. So I think it's important that we get, as a sector, that common data language, that common data standard, and then allow people to innovate on top of that, really. I guess just to finish, I mean, it's another kind of obvious question in many respects, but for many years, local authorities, local councils, are clearly hard pressed in terms of budgets and public spending, and in terms of the amount of planning resource they have. So once again, how do you feel that kind of planning technology and visualization can help them speed up, which is currently a slow process that doesn't really help anybody, whether it's developers or society looking for more housing? How do you think that technology can help really just save costs and make the whole process more efficient?
Yeah, this is a huge issue. We all know that the planning sector is massively under-resourced and has faced a tremendous amount of cuts in the recent future. And that, of course, has a knock-on effect to the service the applicants experience. So it really is an issue that needs to be seen in the round. And for me, the 3D visualization piece boils down to a couple of different things. But the first, again, is about understanding policy and understanding what sits behind making decisions. So to give you a little bit of an example, being able to see what proposed changes look like, but able to overlay that with different layers of data that show you what different policies like in different areas, rather than flicking between pages of PDFs and trying to make those comparisons. Being able to make those, draw those conclusions faster is really, really, really important. But I think the second point to this is that it isn't just about the efficiency internally for planning authorities, but it's also about the efficiency of communicating those points between different stakeholders. And that can be between planning authority and applicant team. That can be when it comes down to public consultation, but critically also when it comes to communicating between planning officer and perhaps committee member, being able to explain the evolution of a scheme, and again, how the application of policy takes effect, and so on and so forth, is really important in being able to ensure that journey is as smooth as possible. And I think it's those areas where there are currently relatively significant inefficiencies that can be improved upon by better communication, better visualization, and better understanding.
I suppose what's interesting, given my kind of personal experience of using the planning system, is that it feels very much like a sort of a staccato game of tennis, where you put your application in, it's looked at, it's either refused or accepted. And I guess one of the challenges and opportunities of this more modeling kind of visualization approach is turning perhaps the process into a much more interactive discussion around a development, rather than this kind of, as I say, staccato back and forth, which just takes ages, rather than perhaps a more interactive way of planning. I mean, do you see planning technology leading to that much more kind of fluid, not in a bad way, but much more kind of interactive discussion about a development, rather than this kind of paper-based back and forth that just takes, well, years sometimes?
Absolutely. And I think a large part of it is down to collaboration and being able to have those conversations sort of there in the room, as it were, rather than having to go away and take feedback and make amendments and so on and so forth, being able to play around with different options. And we've already touched upon the sort of modeling of different scenarios and being able to go through how those might play out, being able to do that there in the conversation rather than having to take it away and do that separately. There's massive efficiencies to be had there. But I think the other thing to bear in mind is that planning is still incredibly paper driven, and you have to have, I would say, a base level of technical understanding to even understand what an architect's drawing is, and being able to translate those into what's going to be there on the ground once there's, spades in. That's a real challenge, but being able to do that in a visual way faster, that means that you take away that need of interpretation, is that there's a huge amount of efficiency that can be given to that part of the process as well. Getting everyone on the same page and thinking about the same thing quicker is a massive benefit.
No, and it comes back to that whole sense of across the sector being more digital, having more BIM models from day one that give you that visualization of the asset itself, and then putting it into place with your kind of technology as well. So a lot of opportunities, but a lot of work to be done. Well, Nikki, it's been a fascinating conversation for today. Thank you ever so much, and I look forward to catching up again in the near future. But thanks ever so much for the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew.
Pleasure.